everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Richard Harries, and I'm Associate Director of the Institute for Community Studies. For those of you who haven't come across us, the Institute for Community Studies is a new kind of evidence centre with people and communities at its heart. Our goal is to understand what matters to local people and what's working for them. And we believe that the involvement of communities in the research process leads to better decision making on the issues that most affect people. And in partnership with Power to Change, the trust that backs community businesses in England, the Institute is delighted to be hosting today's event entitled Looking Back, Moving Forward, How to Fund and Support Community Businesses. And with your help, we're going to be exploring questions such as what kind of funding and support is needed for community businesses to thrive? How might support help to address challenges felt across the community business sector? What we can learn from existing community business support programs? And, on the day that we're having the autumn statement, not a mini budget, what does the future hold for the countries as the country falls into recession? We've assembled a really great panel to help discuss this. We've got Margaret Ajayi from the University of Roehampton, Lily O'Flynn, Principal Consultant and Place-Based Evaluation of Learning at Renacy, Jess Prendergast, Director and Co-Founder of the Onion Collective, and Stephen Miller, Director of Delivery and Impact at Power to Change. And I should say, if you're inspired by what you hear this morning and want to know more about the evidence base that underpins it, then do visit the Institute's online repository at icstudies.org.uk, where you'll find over 400 community-related research documents and datasets. The latest addition to that is a report called Supports and Challenges for Community Businesses, Lessons Learned from Power to Change's Legacy Programme Evaluations, written by Stuart Hall. Stuart is a civic scholar and a PhD candidate supported by the Institute for Community Studies. He currently works, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Stuart, at Vivacity, a charity that provides ownership and management of previously owned local authority assets in sports, arts and cultural services. He wrote the report we're going to be looking at first. The report is much wider than assets, but I'd like to kick off this morning's event by inviting Stuart to share the findings of that report. So, Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And yeah, the report was an opportunity to dive into 17 of the existing publications in the repository, and they ranged from program evaluations to other sort of single author pieces, and really there was quite a broad array of literature on the challenges that community businesses face. And I think even though they were written over time, there's still some poignant findings for the situation community businesses find themselves in now. So I've got 4 key findings really from evaluating those publications. And the first is that as we continue to support community businesses, I think we need to think differently about how we understand them. So perhaps the typology we use for community businesses, or the characteristics that we recognize when supporting them. So one of the findings was to reconsider whether we understand community businesses by their stage of development or whether we understand them by their business model, rather than just seeing the sector that they're in. So that could mean that support provided reflects the stage they're at. So if they're in a pre-venture or a growth stage, then the support should reflect that stage. Or if they're a CIC or a BENCOM, then we ensure that the support that's provided is tailored to the needs and the characteristics of that type of organization. And I would imagine most of the panelists do think in that way with the support they offer, but it seemed there was an emphasis on doing that in more detail, really. A second finding was to take a network approach with the support. So really providing that holistic wraparound support for the community businesses. And there were plenty of examples of where Power to Change had facilitated such approaches. So Power to Change, through many of their funded projects where community businesses would receive support and there would be funding alongside that, they were able to join enabler hubs, so networks where they share resources and have other community businesses supporting them. And there were other examples of peer networks where community businesses who have perhaps gone on the same journey and are at a later stage can then share support to those earlier stage community businesses. And there seemed to be a real power in that approach. It seemed that the community businesses received support which really suited the situation they were in, and meant that over time that support could change to reflect the changing needs that the community businesses had. This links with the third key finding that we've covered in the report, and that's around the support needing to mirror the stage of development that the community businesses are at, and in particular financial support. So the financial support that, say, an early stage community business that has just sort of sprung out of the community needs would be very different to a community business that has been running for multiple years, that may have a slight change of mission in some sense. Their support needs would differ greatly. And this goes back to the first key finding of why understanding them based on their business model or their stage of development is really important. Because by understanding the needs they have at that stage, that support can be tailored to what that community business really needs, particularly with the future in mind. So if they are a growing community business, that financial support could be provided with how that business can be scaled, or how there can be a slight change in focus in the future if necessary factored in. So that was the third key finding. And then the fourth and final key finding from the report is there is a need to really support the cultural development of organizations. And I think this can be really overlooked, and many of the reports and evaluations that were reviewed did highlight the importance of this, but also the challenge in supporting culture in organizations, because it's a very fluffy and intangible concept. So it's clearly difficult for funders, for big support bodies to support community businesses. But understanding the community businesses by their stage of development can help fostering appropriate cultures within the organizations. And it seems that having that mindset of cultural support at the earliest stage possible means that the right cultures can develop, or if the people leading the community business have this in mind, then they can access support about how they can really foster the kind of culture that they think will achieve their social mission or their objectives as a community business. And once that's right at the early stage of their development, as that community business develops, then it's likely that culture will develop in the right way if they're able to then connect with the support that they think they need. So again, really intangible and hard to kind of pin down, but the organizational cultural development of community businesses was really significant. And that's some of the key findings. I'm pretty sure with these four key findings as well, our panelists today will have examples of how this support can look. And I'm happy to answer any questions as well if people want a bit more information.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stuart. That's a really, really helpful introduction for this. And I'm going to pass straight on now to Margaret Ajayi. As I said, Margaret is currently senior lecturer at Roehampton University and a freelance community business consultant. I first came across her as an evaluator when I was working at Power to Change, and Margaret was a key evaluator working on our community business fund. Prior to that, She worked at Locality, and in my view, it's probably most famous for her work at the Upper Norwood Library Hub, and setting up the network of community managed libraries back in 2017, which really marked a turning point in that particular sector of the community business marketplace. But Margaret, I won't blow your trumpet. I'll let you do that. Reflections on what Stuart said, but also more generally about this issue of sort of funding and challenges for community businesses.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sort of going to draw from my experiences at Upper Norwood Library Hub, but also as an assessor on the Community Business Fund, just to share a few snippets from my own sort of, few snippets and reflections as well. I'm going to look at organizations that are very much at the, pre-venture stage. I call it the bright spark or light bulb moment stage, where you have local residents often, with wonderful ideas, want to create change locally, take on an asset, introduce a new service, and so on and so forth. But it's also a stage where it's quite chaotic and delicate for a number of these people. They're not really sure sometimes of what they generally need and who's around to help them. They're not really sure when everything they've started or thinking about will disappear. So, programs such as Trade Up, peer networks, I worked with colleagues to set up the library network, which was invaluable support for a lot of the community libraries that were emerging, because you had nowhere to go to. When we were setting it up, I wish we had somewhere to go to, somewhere to find information and support. So setting it up meant that, other libraries and aspiring ones had somewhere to go for peer support and advice. The other thing is the Sandbox, another program that Party Change ran, and the peer networking program, which helped us to set up the network, all helped us to sort of shape our ideas, learn from other people, engage with people at local level, and also mold our projects as we sort of developed as well. There is support and there has been support, but I think there is a lot more that can be done. And I'm thinking about succession planning, innovation, diversity, cultural development, and sustainability. I'll say that at this stage, what we need more of is differentiated support and investment as well, but also a program which helps funders and partners and local people and agencies to build a good sense of understanding of the people or the communities behind the project. Sometimes we don't know who they are and what they're doing, but these are really inspirational people motivated to create change locally. We need to know them, we need to understand them, but also we need to build greater connections with local authorities and local businesses as well. And the other thing that I'd love to see happen is what I call the test sites. Sites which are linked to maybe more advanced and mature community business, where pre-venture organizations can go and consult, engage, shape the ideas, test them out, and also get some sort of support from a rich diversity of brokers, all backgrounds, to help them as well. In addition, access to role models, coaches and mentors, and also creaming the learning at that stage. Now, when we move on to the inception stage as well, support and investment for groups at this stage is very different. They'll be looking for support around, for example, their legal structures, their governance, business planning, bringing the communities along with them, or looking at how to secure an asset, where to start from, or indeed services that they can deliver for meaningful impact. They also want to define their social purpose at the same time, but also navigate a complex funding field. So, programs such as Bright Ideas, Trade Up, Community Business Fund, Next Generation, Peer Networks, Powering Up, and also programs that connect CBs to local business leaders and others have been available through Party Change, and indeed to local authorities as well. But I think going forward, what is needed is more differentiated support again, and access to funding as and when they need it. But regular dialogue with organizations at this stage to identify the capacity skills and organizational, business and financial needs they have. I'm working with some organizations who, for example, are at this point, and HR is a big challenge for them. As they start to trade and with limited finances available, they really do not know where to go to get the HR support they need. So maybe going forward, more of empowering places, more business development support and technical support to help them hone their business model, connect with local partners who may already be in the community business world as well. At the growth stage, or the stage which I call the stage at which we've arrived, there are still some challenges and still some risks that these organizations, CBs, face as well. We may have trustees in place, paid staff and volunteers that we work with. But also, I think the kind of support that organizations at this stage have had are things like capital and revenue grants, which the CBF, or Community Business Fund, did offer. Social finance was another, peer support and networking, turnaround support for some of them. Collaborative projects was another one as well. And indeed, empowering places, which help CB leaders develop, grow, and transform their own practice, their thinking and approaches. Going forward, funding and support for me is to be focused more on longer term funding, skills development, capacity building, and again, support to develop and hone their business model, as well as closer working relationships with local agencies and local authorities. At the mature stage as well, or the scale stage, resilience, confidence, sustainability are some of the things we think of at this stage, some of the things that we're worried about. And clearly at Upper Norwood Library Hub, it was one of the things that was on our mind all the time. And we never applied for the CBF, but we benefited from the Powering Up program as well, and also from the Trade Up program. Again, at this stage, social finance may be a possibility. But one of the things I'd like to see, and I do talk about a lot, is that I'd love to see CB leaders at community business leaders at board level in funding organizations, so they can actually inform the funding decision making process. I'd like to see them at corporate board level as well, so they can share some of the social innovation and fantastic stuff that we do. It raises our profile, it raises our reputation. And I know some of you know that quite a number of us are also involved on the High Street Challenge as well. And so collaborative working, raising our profile, again, much more differentiated funding at this stage would support and help CBs at that stage. I hope that covers everything. I've said quite a lot.
No. Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. That's very helpful. And I was really struck actually by what you were saying about the kind of creative spark at the beginning of community business, because point of confession, when I joined Power to Change back in 2015, I was a little bit embarrassed by the name. Power to Change sounds very sort of in your face and not particularly British. But actually, when I went out to visit the community businesses who are running these things, I mean, it's all about power. It's all about taking power and doing things on your own terms, and that creativity, that spark is enormous. And how organizations like Power to Change and other funders and government can help to sort of foster that flame and grow it, I think is really important. And I do note that the first question from Hannah, which we'll come to when we get to the discussion section, is about Stuart's point about fostering the right culture and whether that's about entrepreneurialism. What do we think the right culture for community businesses is? So let's hold that in our head for the conversation. And to the audience, please do keep adding to those questions. I'll turn now to Lily. Lily, as I said, is Principal Consultant for Place-Based Evaluation and Learning at Renesi. Margaret mentioned on a number of occasions the importance of the Empowering Places programme. It's definitely a flagship programme for Power to Change, and Lily knows all about that. But Lily, if you would like to talk about that, or more generally the kind of topic of learning support, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm talking as an evaluator of the Empowering Places programme, which works in 6 local areas, and it kind of catalyses new community businesses from those areas using a kind of a wraparound support and funding and a combination of the two. So my experience is from that angle, and so I thought it'd be useful to kind of talk through some of the stuff that tallies with what we're hearing, as well as what we've seen in the report. And I think one of the things that really resonated for me was that transitioning between the different life cycles. So moving from the pre-venture stage into the inception stage, and moving from the inception stage into the growth stage are really, really critical points of needing support and needing that kind of additional wraparound stuff from a funder or from a capacity builder. In Empowering Places, we definitely found that for moving from the pre-venture stage into the inception stage, there was the kind of need for those specific skills in business planning, business modelling, knowing what governance structure you're going to go for, knowing even what the governance structures are, and things like HR and finances as well, as Margaret mentioned. But also at that kind of pre-venture into inception stage. And I think you just talked about that, Richard, and drawing on Margaret's point about the creative spark, we found you needed time and you needed resource, you needed to be resourced to have time to kind of to support that creative spark and to test and to innovate new ideas and to have, you know, even like small injections of funding to help people kind of be more innovative or test things. And I think actually having a really flexible funder like Power to Change that allowed them to do that, allowed them to make mistakes and allowed that kind of creative spark to be tested was really, really important at that stage. Moving into the kind of the next stage, which was that inception to growth, which is where it all happens, as Margaret said, is that bit felt really high risk. So this is when we were seeing people moving from their full-time jobs and then kind of and taking off with their community business career. But it felt like, you know, we had lots of examples of people borrowing money from families that they hadn't been able to pay back, and that's a massive responsibility, that point of going from inception to growth. And I think that bit's really key for funders and capacity builders to be there and to be able to support people through this kind of massive risk that they're taking, but very exciting risk, but they need to be kind of resourced and able and confident to kind of bring themselves through that. So things that we found really useful was the kind of that holistic support that Stuart talked about. So the kind of wraparound coaching, capacity building, and again, time was really important to do that well. Things like an injection of cash through programs like CBF were also super useful. And we heard a lot from the Empowering Places groups about the importance of assets at this stage as well, which allowed them to be, the community businesses to be much more visible. It allowed them it allowed it to work better if they had an asset and kind of increase their customer base and create local networks and so on. Another really interesting thing we found about the report was the stuff around networks. So Empowering Places uses networks in lots of different ways. So there was a peer network amongst those delivering the program. So across the 6 places to kind of learn from each other. And that was really, really useful. And we saw a lot of positive replication coming from that. And I think you've talked about that in the report and how kind of those who are further ahead can support those who are at earlier stages. And also to work through challenging situations together, we found was really important to have someone who was also going through that kind of thing. And I think that leads me on to something that feels slightly less tangible, but it was really important in Empowering Places, and that was around the kind of informal networks and the kind of relationships and trust that are really critical for community businesses to be able to run. And maybe that's the point around cultures that Stuart was talking to, but it feels like there's something that in order to be successful community business leaders need to be able to have the trust of their community. They need to be able to really understand their community, and they also need to have really good relationships across their place. And I feel like that's like any business really. In order to thrive, you need to have good relationships with clients. I mean, business is built on you know, great client relationships, and you see big business is all about that. So I think that's just as important for community businesses to kind of draw into their way of being and really kind of create a culture that allows them to have those really good relationships. And I think again that goes back to the point around time and also kind of having knowledge and understanding around their local area. But maybe that's something about key characteristics that business owners need. But those were my kind of key reflections.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lily. Now we're going to move on to Jess Prendergast. I'm just going to tease Jess by describing her as like me, a former civil servant and think tank policy wonk. But that's really where the similarity ends, because Jess has also in her time been a trustee at Power to Change, but much more importantly was, as I said at the introduction, co-founder of the Onion Collective down in Watchet in Somerset, where she has done frankly stunning work, the sort of thing that I could only dream of. I mean, it's just absolutely staggering what they've been able to achieve. And when I was at Power to Change, it was a great joy supporting Onion Collective as much as we could. Jess, you've seen community businesses really from all sides, from government, from the inside of Power to Change, and from actually running a very successful community business. What are your reflections?
Thank you, Richard. Always terrible to start by reminding everyone I was once a civil servant. I apologise to everyone for it. But I escaped to Westminster, as Richard said, and ended up in Watchet in Somerset, which is actually where I grew up as well. And I think that's really important. So back to my kind of home and the community, which I was a part of as a young person. And as Richard said, I established Onion Collective with now four other amazing women, but also two other community businesses, one in the youth sector, which was one of the first CICs actually ever established in the country and is still going strong, and another in the cultural sector, which has just this week become an NPO. So quite a lot of experience across different sectors of community business, but also taking all of those organisations through these growth stages. And I think Onion probably qualifies as being in what is the fourth stage in this typology. Though I'll admit some reticence about the scale stage, because it reminds me of the kind of private sector typology, because it makes my skin crawl a little bit. And I do wonder whether there's a more appropriate way to think about the trajectories of community businesses that isn't echoing that kind of private sector ambition, which might not be appropriate, particularly where embeddedness is king. I think, you know, I recognise a lot of this in this report, of course. I mean, that's understandable, having gone through these things. For us, just to reflect really on what was most important, and Richard will have heard me said this at many a board meeting and change. Like, all of this support is well and good, but really what everyone needs is some money. And that is, you know, should remain the key and essential goal and role of funders. The rest is to some degree peripheral, important, but peripheral to that fundamental goal. And I think it's really important that that doesn't get forgotten. So, you know, by far the most important thing that enabled us to exist and thrive was funding at really key points from Power to Change, but also from, you know, a range of other funders. And that, you know, that money is the key thing. Beyond that, I think the kind of technical support was really, really critical for us, and often very hard to find. And by that, I mean legal or financial advice, but often really specific, you know, tax laws and state aid and these things which are, you know, require very expensive people to tell you exactly what you need to know, and it's very, very hard to access as community businesses. So I think where that was for Idle, where we were able to access that was one of the other places where it really made a difference to our ability to feel confident. And then as this report, and as everyone has spoken about, peer support obviously massively critical. But I think, and I don't know if this is because of the kind of nature of our organisation, but I think for us what was important wasn't really this is how you should do this, but the sense of a tribe around us and a feeling of not being alone, and we can do this because there's loads of us trying to do it together. And that was more important than, you know, I didn't ring up people in my tribe and say, how do I do X? I rang them up in tears and said, I can't do this and I need you to help me. You know, and it wasn't help that was about, have you tried this business idea? It was like, it's all right, we're here, we've got this, you're going to be okay, we can do it. And that, I think, is really, really valuable and really important, and perhaps doesn't get enough recognition. And I think probably what that also for me says is to remember that this isn't about, it's not just about organisations or types of organisations or sectors, it's about people. You know, these organisations are really just people, individuals, teams of individuals, complex, messy, you know, sometimes struggling individuals, and support needs to recognise that, be empathetic to that, be compassionate to that. And of course, that also has an impact in what Lily was saying about relationships and the way that people connect and how they manage all of that. That's really kind of key. And again, I'm not sure some of that comes through I know that Stuart talked about social capital, and I think that's, you know, clearly a critical part of it, but I think it's perhaps more the bonding social capital than the bridging that really needs the kind of emphasis here. So the relationships point, I think, is very key. And trust as well, which again everyone has mentioned, from funders to those organisations they're supporting, and an ability to be flexible and to recognise that, you know, the people on the ground do tend to know what they need and what they're doing, and trusting them to articulate that and respect that is vital. The last thing I really wanted to touch on, though, is that the title of this session is about also moving forward. And one of the things that struck me reading this report was that it's a very, I think, accurate portrayal of what's gone so far, but I'm not sure how accurate it will be going forward, because it feels like the last 2-3 years have changed so much in the sector. You know, there really is a completely different situation now, and it looks like the next decade to 3 decades will be completely different to the ones we've lived up until now. I wonder if there's going to be a stage tacked onto the end of this, which is survival or adaptation. You know, how do we do this stuff in an economy that is collapsing, for want of a better expression, you know, that isn't working anymore, where there's real economic and social hardship, and community businesses then aren't trying to grow and scale. They're trying to survive and help on the ground, and they're trying to really kind of, I think in some ways their role will change, and therefore their support needs will change. And I think community businesses can be the real pioneers who come out of the ashes of a broken economy, but they'll only do that if they make it through themselves. And for me, that needs really significant, stable, steadying grants with flexibility and trust. And it needs not just financial support, but that support for kind of mental resilience, and people being alongside. So I think if I was a funder, I'd be thinking about that. The sector is in an incredible place, but it's also more exhausted than I've ever seen it. And I think if I was a funder, I would be thinking, how do you know, I'd be looking to the future very rapidly and thinking, how should we fund differently or support differently in the context where things are, you know, nowhere near as rosy as they have been. And that would be my kind of move forward. What does a survival or adaptation typology look like, and how do we do that?
Jess, thank you very much indeed. And of course, Stuart's sort of typology is taken from the work of Adam Swirsky and James Plunkett back in 2015, when they were sort of looking at what community businesses might be, and they were quite keen, as I recall, to avoid the sort of standard private sector model of endless growth. They recognized that wasn't appropriate, but these sorts of typologies are difficult. And of course, you know, this is the month, or was it last month, where we saw Hackney Community Transport sadly go into administration. You know, and it can be tough the bigger you get. I mean, it's tough. It's tough at the start, and it's tough as you get big. It's probably tough all the way through. But the other model that, from what you were saying, that really struck me was, unlike the private sector model of the heroic sole entrepreneur forging away, it's all about community and relationship and doing things together, whether it's for women in Watch It or whether it's a community wherever it might be. But it is community. The word community and community business is very important. So no, thank you for that. And actually, just a question, a thought to plant with the audience for questions later. But you know, the fact that it is for women in Watch It is I think quite interesting. I think there's a very strong gendered element to community business. You know, I'm doing this webinar today from the British Academy, where later this morning we're doing an event on social infrastructure. And one of the things that we found when we look at social infrastructure around the country is it's often, frankly, run and done by sort of brilliant women around the country. That could be entirely atypical and apocryphal, but I think there's something there. I'd be really interested if others in the audience thought so as well. But look, I'll hand over now to Stephen Miller. Stephen is Director of Delivery Impact at Power to Change, as I say. Prior to that, Stephen's got sort of long history in this sector. He worked at the Community Development Foundation when that was around, at Unlimited, at the Design Council before joining Power to Change. He's also a trustee of the Charity Evaluation Working Group. And a bit like Jess, but possibly even more detail, has really seen what funding and support for community businesses look like from the inside in his time at Power to Change. Stephen, over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone else for those reflections, contributions. There's a lot that resonated in everything everyone said, so I'll just try and sort of expand and elaborate on that, I think, and talk about how how Exchange has evolved its support for community businesses since some of these programs were originally sort of commissioned, but also the sort of lessons that we have learned that are potentially useful for other funders looking to support community businesses. And I think sort of my reflections are that there's effectively 4 key elements, and I'll expand on all of those that hopefully address some of the points that Jess and Margaret and Lily have raised as well. So the first is, I think the key thing is about connecting community businesses to support, resources and ideas to help them improve their own impact, as well as thinking about their sort of longer term resilience. And we have thought about resources in the broadest term. So I think, as Jess mentioned, like clearly there's a need to provide funding, and that's what we primarily exist to provide. And the thing that we have learned over the last few years is that the way that funding is provided could always be improved. And I think many people in the audience will have had experiences maybe with us, but also with other funders, where potentially there's a few hoops to jump through to get access to money. So we've been really thinking about how do we make our funding as flexible as possible, but as easy to access as possible. And underpinning that is trust, and really trusting that communities know best about the challenges they face and how to address them, and they know how best to sort of allocate and target money and funding, but also that actual incidences of fraud amongst charities and first sector organizations is actually very low. Partly that might be because of some of the due diligence processes, etc. But actually, I think what COVID has taught us is that there is a lot of good work happening across the country, and we just need to trust that people can just sort of get on with things if given the right resources. So funding is it's obviously a key thing. And then the other thing for us in terms of resources, that as a time limited foundation, we know that we're not around forever. So working in partnership and collaboration with other funders, policymakers, think tanks, etc., organizations that can help grow and develop this space further is absolutely key. So we've been building our networks and working in collaboration with a whole range of different organizations to think about how we bring more resources into the community business sector, but likewise also thinking about the resources that already exist within the sector. So there's lots of skills, knowledge and experience, and how do we connect community businesses to each other? And that peer-to-peer connection has come up a few times in the conversation already this morning. So I think there's that, and then the other thing is really thinking about supporting. So I was reflecting on Jess's point there about the last stage in this growth journey, and actually I sort of see it maybe potentially splitting off into 3 different ways. So you've got what Stuart suggested around scaling, then Jess's point around adaptation, but then also I think the sort of middle route around maintenance, and that's the thing that's potentially often overlooked in some of these discussions when thinking about, well, actually, once those organizations reach a certain level of maturity, they still need support to maintain their existing services and the work they do within the community. So we're really thinking about that. But we've also been thinking about Jess's point around adaptation, and actually, the external context has changed a lot over the last few years, and we're in a sort of permanent state of crisis at the moment. And so how do we not just help I suppose communities sort of meet those short-term immediate pressures and adapt to those, but also thrive in those and actually get ahead of the curve. So some of the things we're looking at are, how can communities get ahead in the transition to net zero? How can communities get ahead in the sort of digitalization of our economy, so that the sort of existing structures and concentration of wealth and power don't get replicated in the new economy that emerges from the sort of flux we're in at the moment. So supporting community business maintenance and innovation is quite key. Then the sort of third point is around improving understanding of what community businesses themselves can provide, as well as what they need. So we've been consciously trying to adopt an asset-based approach. So really thinking about what are the existing skills and knowledge within communities that can be better mobilized and leveraged, and how do we unlock the sort of barriers to them doing that, and it's trying to move away, I think, from this sort of inherent deficit-based model that sometimes exists within funding, that actually these organizations are lacking skills or lacking something and they need to be given it to them by someone else. But actually it's about how do we activate what is already there and then help them connect with others who may have the sort of skills and knowledge that they need access to. And so we've been doing that in a range of different ways. So, you know, we've moved away from talking about capacity building. So we talk about, so we adopt a capabilities approach, so building on the work of Amartya Sen and others, and really thinking about when we are working with community business leaders to think about how they develop personally, but also with their teams, like how do we facilitate that peer-to-peer connection as well as unlocking the sort of skills and talent they already have. And then we've also been trying to better utilize that in thinking about how we support the sector more widely. So all of the sort of fund design work that we do now is done in collaboration with community business leaders, and so that might be through the sort of initial design phase, and we're like really conscious about diversity in the broader sense here as well, to make sure we get diversity of perspectives involved in the earliest stages. But also we have a range of community business leaders on the board of our trust. And we also have a network of community business leaders, which we've accessed on a regular basis over several years to, I suppose, tell us what is happening within their communities and also help us shape up what the response would be. So it's not just power to change leading that discussion. And then the very final thing is about advocating for more community ownership and greater community power. And that's why we have this network of community business leaders to help us understand what is happening in the sector and in communities across the country, so that we can platform their voice, as well as then obviously use our own networks to advocate on their behalf if required. So I think those are the sort of those four key things about, you know, connecting to support and resources, supporting innovation and maintenance, improving understanding of what community businesses can provide, and then advocating for community ownership and power. That are sort of four key things that we're doing, and I think others could do in the future as well. So they're my reflections.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. All really helpful. And, you know, your point in particular, I was just looking at the questions while you were talking about diversity, and I saw there was a question there from Anna, which looks particularly relevant. So we'll come on to that in a second. So we are now at the point where we want to open up the conversation. And as I said in the chat, I'm quite keen that we do it on video. So it's not just our voices, but you have the opportunity to ask to ask a question, not least because, you know, when you wrote the question, we've had a subsequent conversation, you might want to modify it. And but I wanted to go to Hannah first, because Hannah, you were the delight of every chair. You chucked in a question very early on, which gave me reassurance that we would have some questions to ask. So Hannah Corbett, do you want to ask your question about Stuart's point on the culture?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
Can't
great.
see you, we can hear you.
I found the point about culture really interesting, and Stuart said it, you know, at this point in time it's a little bit vague in terms of what we mean by that, and a bit fluffy. So with that in mind, what does the right culture of a community business look like? And it may be that it depends on the stage of that business, and what kind of mindset does that community business need, I guess, in order to survive and thrive?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hannah. And I'll just say to the panelists, I don't feel you all have to answer all the questions. So perhaps maybe if we use the hands up feature, I'll bring you in. But I wanted to start with Stuart, since it was it's a point you'd made, Stuart. Is there anything more you want to add on what fostering the right culture might look like?
Yeah, so it's worth adding that this is sort of the crux of my PhD research as well. So I do spend a lot of time asking myself that question, and I want to be a bit cheeky and kind of rephrase the question, because I don't think there is a right culture. I think instead what we need to look for is a right way of developing cultures, and that's around the leaders or you know, if it's a formal community business, the trustees and the management of that community business being genuinely connected with the community that they recognize as their community of focus or as their beneficiaries. So that could be, if they run an asset, that could be, you know, connected with the geographical community. If they have a particular like demographic of focus, it could be that there's some kind of personal connection with that type of community. And I think that that's the right starting point, having that connection with the community. And it needs to be a two-way connection so that the community members can be involved in what the community business does. And once that starts, it then, I think cultures, they can start to form themselves, but they then also need that more structured approach to developing the culture. So the community need to be involved somewhat around what the focus of the community business is, and that needs to kind of happen over time. That could be through consultation, it could be through doing surveys of service users, and that goes some way to really helping those running the community business understand, if they've got those sort of bright sparks and those visions in their mind, how that can then materialize and how a culture can form off that. And I think in terms of funders and other support bodies helping with that culture, I think there's a role for them in stepping back as well and accepting that, you know, sometimes these community businesses, even if they are struggling, they may know best. They know their community best. They know what they do best. And there's a role for those types of organizations to listen more than they speak, and then try and help with fostering cultures.
Thanks, Stuart. I can see my fellow panelists have singly ignored my offer to put hands up to ask. But I was going to, Lily, just as well, because I was about to go to you anyway. Lily, particularly from an empowering place, and particularly the wider to Hannah's question, is it about an entrepreneurial mindset, whether you think that's a relevant fact or not?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I feel that kind of point about entrepreneurial, and it kind of feeds into what Stuart was saying about understanding the needs and kind of being clever about that kind of two-way feedback loop, and being able to be adaptable and to kind of to move with the community. Something we found from Empowering Places actually was that it was often one or two people who really kind of kept the culture going or worked tirelessly to kind of create this culture. But actually where it was missing was when it wasn't embedded within the whole organization. So you just have one kind of bright spark person who was doing all of that. So I think potentially something that could help is for funders to help kind of give the time and resource for that to be embedded within the organization, whether that's through organizational strategies or values, or something that kind of allows people to be on board and allows people to also reach that strategic level that helps them also have that two-way conversation as well, and to kind of help adapt the community business as well.
Thanks, Lily. Jess.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so a couple of things. I think it's an interesting that the importance of the community bit, because I think it's also worth recognising that community businesses can transition from being community businesses to just being social enterprises or businesses. The community part is important in defining them as community businesses, but not fundamentally important in whether they are doing good work or a valid or a solid and important people and organisations. And I think that's quite critical. In terms of entrepreneurialism and these kinds of things that are cultural, we've tried to think about what it is that works at Onion, has worked, and we talk about our skin evolving. So what I mean by that is that sometimes you really need a very thick skin to do this job. Being in community is extremely hard. Communities don't have an opinion; they have 1,000 opinions. And navigating that can be personally difficult and tough. So you need a really thick skin, but you also need a really thin skin, because if you get too thick of a skin, you stop listening, you stop paying attention, then you're not doing your job properly. So there's a kind of ability to reflect and understand when you need to open up and when you need to kind of close yourself in and hide for a bit, and how to navigate that, I think, is probably one of the hardest bits about running community business, but also a really vital one. And sort of really just comes down to compassion and empathy for the people that you're working with and around and for. In terms of entrepreneurialism, people talk about, like, I don't know that I'm entrepreneurial or that we are. I think we're risk takers. And I think that's maybe the bit of entrepreneurialism that matters. We're able to take risks, and in part that's because of the support we're given by our funders. But it's also something, it is something in our, it's just something I am, I don't know how you teach that. But the bit that matters then is a culture where you can recognise where something's moving from risk to threat and take the step back or make a change. And I think, again, that's a very difficult thing, and one of the things that's really critical. And then the other thing I think that's really important, and why I love this sector so much, is that I think community businesses that are successful and have good cultures are the ones that are having fun. Because this is too hard, this work is too hard if it's not also really good fun. Like, not all the time, sometimes it's really not. But a sense in which you're doing this with your community and you're going to enjoy the process, because that's the whole point of community after all. I think all of those things are kind of really critical in culture. I don't know how you might try and support organisations to have more fun, but it'd be a good challenge for power to change.
Thanks, Jess. Just on the word entrepreneurial, I've got to say that I apologise in advance. This is just the pure geek in me, but the etymology of the word business is from the Anglo-Saxon root word besig, which is to care, whereas enterprise is from the French, or undertake, to undertake something. And I always think it's a choice between whether you want to be a caring organisation or an undertaker. And I will go with caring rather than being an undertaker any day. So community business, there we go. Now, we've got a great question from Neil, but Neil, if you forgive me, I'm going to jump over you and go to Anna, just because it relates to this question of the characteristics, I guess, of what it takes to run a community business. Anna was responding to my point about sex and gender, and Anna, I'll let you ask the question yourself.
Thanks, Richard. I just found it interesting. I don't know what the statistics are, what the numbers say about the number of women in the social enterprise or community business sector, but my reaction to that was that I thought it was very important to break that down even more. So women are 50% of the population. That's not a useful statistic. It's not, doesn't tell us very much at all, really. So what else? What are the other characteristics? What are the other characteristics of those who are most prevalent in the sector? And what Jessica was just saying about being both thick-skinned and thin-skinned, and defining, rather than being entrepreneurial, being sort of comfortable with risk. Perhaps those are the more interesting facts that we might uncover about the kind of people who feel moved to step into the world of social enterprise and community business. So it'd be great to hear, what those other factors are.
Thanks, Anna. I think it's a really, really interesting question. I can see Jess and Stephen both got their hands up. Margaret, when I introduced you, mentioned the work you've been doing on equality, diversity and inclusion, but you might also want to have a comment on the intersectionality aspects of running a community business. But I'll go to Stephen first and then Jess.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question, and so I'll sort of come at it from two angles, I think, because as Richard said, I've worked in the sector for quite a while, so I've seen the data related to social enterprise, which is potentially slightly better than the data related to community business. But I'll talk about the community business data first. So we at Power to Change, we have tried to look at the sort of demographics of the sector using what data is available. And whilst it's not sort of completely authoritative, it does give a good indication, I think, of the potential makeup of the sector that also I think is supported through qualitative research and then I think also people's experience. So I don't think it will be a surprise that the majority of the sector does seem to be like led and staffed by women. I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but it was more than 50%. And that would chime with research that we've seen elsewhere. So NCVOs, Almanac shows that the voluntary and community sector more broadly is largely staffed and volunteered by women as well. And there's a range of different reasons for that, which people might be familiar with. But it does then link, I think, back to Anna's point around risk as well. So what we've seen in the research from social enterprise is that that can have obviously lots of positive benefits, but also it can present some challenges in terms of access to particular types of finance and capital, whereby maybe certain groups are more forthcoming for applying for social investment, for example, than others, because they have potentially greater risk appetite because of their lived experience and situation. So older middle-class men are more likely to apply for that type of investment because they have greater financial security, let's say. So all of that interacts. So it's really important to consider the sort of demographic characteristics of the sector. And then the other thing, I think, which the point I want to make, and why this is being particularly important for us at Power to Change, is that we had observed that the sector was also older as well, and had like a sort of much older age profile than potentially the voluntary and community sector more broadly. And there is nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it has at points presented a challenge, and particularly I think relating to Margaret's point around succession is a challenge, because people are retiring, not just retiring from work, but retiring from running community businesses. But also when when the country went into lockdown, what we saw was that many community businesses were on the front line responding immediately to the community needs, but there were others where their volunteers had to shield or shelter, and they weren't able to move their services online, and so thus those organizations weren't necessarily always able to meet community needs. So there's a need, I think, more broadly to sort of diversify the types of people that are involved in the sector, not just in terms of sex and ethnicity, but also in terms of age as well. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll go to Jess and then hopefully Margaret as well. Jess.
Thank you. I noticed there was a reference in the chat to gobby women, and I suspect I might be characterised as such, but I'm going to assume it's a positive trait. I think as well as the kind of risk point and the compassion point, I think the other thing that is probably one of the characteristics that spurs people is anger, which is, the sort of injustice and sense that someone needs to do something about a serious problem on the ground with your people, as it were. And I think that it would be interesting to understand whether that incentive is an important one that plays into the characteristics of the people who do this work. I think there might also be a bit of a distinction, kind of thinking about what you were saying there, Stephen, in terms of, maybe it's another typology of community businesses, but I think there's a difference between the kind of ambitious, disruptive community businesses like our New Collective, where you're really trying to shake up the way the economy is working, from that section of community businesses who are doing extraordinary service-based work, but which is more what I talk about as kind of sticking plasters, right? It's fixing a problem on the ground. It's not trying to change the system. And I wonder whether the profile of people involved in those two kind of different types of organisation might change. And then I think just on the dominance of women, if it's a dominance, which might be the only place where there is a dominance by women, but for me, it strikes me that we always talk about having children as a negative impact on women's career prospects, of course, a negative impact on their finances. But for all of the women I've worked with who've made this jump, it's because there is something liberating about a career break caused by having children. It's not just a negative. You step back and you're able to make an active, you've got space to make an active choice to change your career, which, frankly, men don't get that opportunity. They don't get the chance to step out for a year, look at it and think, do I really want to be doing this, or could I be doing something else? And I think women at that age, in their early 30s, late 20s, get this opportunity, and many of them then make a different choice and don't go back into what they're doing before, but think, I'm going to make my own choice and can step into community business that way. So I see it as this kind of really liberating possibility that having children gave me, and certainly my colleagues, that we were able to then make our own choice. And our husbands, partners weren't able to, and are still stuck doing the job they hated at 30 and still doing it now, but we've all been able to choose. So I wonder how much the kind of having children gives an opportunity, and how much that would play out in the statistics as well.
That is an absolutely fascinating point, Jess. It reminds me of a wonderful woman I used to work with, Elizabeth Hoodless, who ran CSV for many years. And she was definitely a formidable voluntary sector leader. She always said, find a job you love and you'll never work a day again in your life. And she certainly did find a job she loved in CSV. But Margaret, I promised I'd bring you in. Are you there?
I am here. I do apologize. I have tried everything I can to keep this camera going and it's not working. But I just wanted to sort of pick on the point I made about succession planning, because I mean, you're right. When I was going around assessing, one of the things I noticed is very much around the age of the community business leaders, what do you call it, in our sector. And I'm really, really keen to see a lot more investment in young people, in creating that pool of talent that will take on the mantle when we move forward. And I think that there's something about leadership development. There's something about some of them. I mean, I was also involved recently in the Trade App program as well. And, you know, I know that a lot of effort was put into trying to attract more diversity, but also more young people. And, you know, I think there is something about a lot of these young people themselves and people from diverse groups not necessarily knowing where to go to, not necessarily hearing how to access this kind of information. I mean, I tried at the university, for example, to try and encourage some of the young people to take part in Trade App. And I think there's a need for some connections, Power to Change perhaps, and other funders to connect more with the university sector, because I'm seeing lots of these young people and talking to them on a day-to-day basis, saying to me, I'd like to do my own thing, but where do I go to? Where do I start from? They are not interested in working for the corporates. They want to work at local level because, as I said, Jess, some of them are angry. Some of them are sad. Some of them are challenged. They've seen lots and lots of great services disappear and they want to do something. So we have debates, discussions around, well, what can you do? And they say, well, where do we start from? Who do we go to? And I think there's some work that funders potentially need to do to engage these young minds who can see some of the challenges on the ground. They're understanding it. They're picking them up and they're saying, we want to do something. How do you bring them on board? And I think Trade App is great, but maybe those connections or collaborations with, you know, people like us and, you know, bringing some of the community business leaders into the, what do you call, educational sphere might make that happen. Not forgetting the fact that, again, when it comes to diversity, there are some, you know, groups, disabled groups, ethnic minority groups who are sort of, you know, ignored in the process. How do we reach them as well? How do we engage them and give them, you know, full access and equal access as well?
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you. Now I'm going to do something very bold here and try and bring in both Neil and Emily, who've asked kind of related questions, or at least I think they're related, around the role of the fund and the role of support as opposed to funding. So Neil, do you want to ask your question first, and then we'll ask Emily to kind of augment with hers. And by all means, I say, if you want to change it from what you've originally written, that's absolutely fine. Neil.
Sure. Thanks, Richard, and thanks to the panel. Really enjoying the discussion, particularly enjoyed the comments, questions and answers on issues of culture, which is I've always been very interested in, so much so that I actually did my master's dissertation on organisational culture in community businesses, particularly the maintenance of culture in fast-growing community businesses. So that really took me back. So I enjoyed that. So coming on to my question. So at Access, where I am now, Foundation for Social Investment, we have an enterprise development programme which offers a whole range of financial and practical support to social enterprises, not just community businesses, but I think it's applicable. What we've actually found, what we're finding through that programme, that the number one benefit that participants find are less the tangible elements of support we've got on offer and more just the space and time it affords for participants and senior leaders to assess, to reflect and to plan. And so my question's in two parts. Firstly, to what extent does that chime with the panel's experience? And you know, I know Jess made the comments before about sometimes organisations don't necessarily need advice, they need the support and encouragement that you've got this. So, you know, perhaps we've heard that already. And second part of my question, if that does chime, and we do think that's important, how do we achieve that breathing space? And to note that the most typical way that tends to be achieved by funders in particular is kind of grants for backfilling, which I've never been entirely convinced about, because I don't think just an injection of finance really enables too busy people to stop being too busy, in my experience. So what's the answer to give people that breathing space?
Thanks so much, Neil. And Emily, do you want to tag your question on as well?
Yes, thank you. My question was, where do you feel the role of a funder ends? I think the wraparound support is brilliant and vital, but I do have a concern around funders diluting the richness of community businesses by potentially overpowering the sector, by kind of taking control of what is ours and theirs, and where is the divide between what is ours as community businesses and theirs as funders.
Thank you very much. And I'll just add a final rider myself, which was an email I received from someone who couldn't join us today. Some of you will know him, Warren Carter down in Brighton. I first came across him because when he was running the brilliant Bevy pub on the Bevendine and Moulscombe estate down there. And his point he said he would make if he'd been able to join us today was 4 things. What people want from funders is money without drowning in endless paperwork. They want trust. You know, a few, as he says, might rip you off, but don't use that as an excuse to make everyone jump through endless hoops. He wants funders that visit projects, especially important for organizations in working class areas who aren't as good at playing the paperwork game. And he wants humility from funders. You're not doing the hard graft, you're just handing out the cash. Organizations shouldn't have to say how brilliant you are. Anyone can give out someone else's money. So anyone who knows Warren knows that's very much his style. Tough but relevant questions, and all related to, you know, what is it that we want from funders? Is it cash? Is it support? If it's support, what kind of support is it? As Emily says, where does the role of funder end? It's a sort of rich area of work. I'm tempted to go to Stephen first, but I'd actually rather wait for you to the end, if that's all right, Stephen. Would another colleague from the panel like to have a go at this?
I'm happy to kick us off. So I think from evaluating, what we've found is that, I mean, completely agree, Neil, backfilling is hard. And I think when it doesn't work, it's when you're backfilled to do a kind of specific thing for a number of months or something. And when backfilling works well, when we've seen it work well, is when you're recruiting a senior person and it's a number of years that person can help step in and run the business and doesn't have to do all of the strategic stuff, the relationship stuff, but they're able to kind of hold the business together. And I think that can work really well, and it allows that kind of more senior person to have the space to be innovative and to build relationships and so on. I suppose another thing in relation to the next point, I was just thinking around where the role of funders end, and those reflections, Richard, are really useful. I've also found from the Empowering Places project that actually where it's been able to end successfully and where people have felt they haven't needed that support, or they haven't felt kind of too overwhelmed by the support, is when they are independent enough themselves. And from what I've seen, that means having an asset, which means they're kind of sustainable and visible, but also having really good networks in their place. And so if the funder can give them funding or support to be able to secure those things, then they feel like they're kind of independent enough to be able to kind of thrive without any additional support.
Thanks, Lily. Margaret or Jess, if you want to add to this.
So, okay. Do you want to go, Jess, or happy for me to go? Okay, so what I was going to say was that I'm just reflecting on when I was at Upper Norwood Library Hub and what would have helped. I mean, backfilling, no. What I needed most was I needed capacity on the ground. And I think for me was having the funding, was having additional support, whether it's in the community or other, to be able to get the job done, basically. So, I mean, backfilling doesn't work or couldn't have worked for us. I think that it was just knowing that there was cash coming in and there was also somewhere or someone I can go to if I needed help. I'm going to go back to the point I made about HR. I'm working with 2 organizations at the moment where human resources is a big challenge for them. And the first question they ask me all the time is, where do I go and access the support I need from HR? Who is there to help me? And so, you know, already I'm sort of telling about some of the organizations out there who can help them. But I mean, I've often wondered whether it is possible for a CB that's dedicated to HR work is needed in our sector, for example. And so, yes, backfilling money for me, no, it didn't work. I just needed to have the money to bring in the additional capacity to make a difference.
Thank you, Margaret. Jess.
Yeah, I think I'd probably echo that. I mean, it's a live question for us at Onion. I think it's been a tricky couple of years, and we're in a process of really kind of rethinking what our core focus is and what direction is coming out of the pandemic and so on. Or at least I keep telling people that's what we're in the process of doing. But actually for 6 months, I've been trying to find the time to get all the directors away in order to do that process, because we simply can't do it if we're anywhere near the ground. It doesn't happen. In the end, me and Naomi went on holiday together in order to find some time to talk about the strategic direction of our company, which is an absurd situation, right? That is not what you're supposed to do on your holiday. That says something about us, that's what we wanted to do on holiday. But I think so. It's not really feeling, but it is space, and it's perhaps, you know, it is perhaps sending people away for a week. You know, you just need room, and that's hard to find. I think the other thing though is I think that community business leaders still spend way too much time on the kind of funding treadmill. And if anyone isn't following Imi Kerr from Civic Square on Twitter, well, Twitter still exists, you absolutely should. She's angry and vocal about this at the moment, that we spend so much time trying to raise money or report on the money or fulfill the burden of having been given money by a funder, which requires us to constantly tell you how brilliant we are, what we're doing, that we can be trusted, that we're doing good work, instead of getting on with doing the work. You know, just giving us all a bit more long-term core grants and freedom and trust, so that we can do the work instead of the work of persuading you we should do the work and that we're worth it, would go a really long way to giving, you know, some of the kind of, particularly some of these kind of ambitious and disruptive organizations a bit of space to take this next step, be able to adapt, survive the next decade or so. So I think there is something in that kind of trust us and leave us alone. You know, once in a while you'll get it wrong, but mostly you won't. And you know, that's how the private sector does this. That's how they fund. Venture capitalists don't dig into every little thing and expect you to report every 3 months. They give you the money and they trust you to get on with it. And sometimes it doesn't work, but mostly it does. So I think there's something about that kind of attitude that should be or could be shifting, perhaps.
Thank you, Jess. And I can see Wendy Hart in the comments has made the same point about core costs. So yeah, it's a relevant one. Stephen, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, all of those points really resonate, and I agree with all of them, and I'll try and sort of address them in the round. I think so. You know, one of the things that we've been trying to do is provide more flexible funding that can be used as is most appropriate by the community business to decide whether that is backfilling staff time or is, you know, investing in insulation for the building or what have you. So we're sort of moving towards that model more and more, but there are sort of structural challenges which everyone is trying to navigate. And so one of the other things that we've been trying to do is think about sort of structural and system improvements to really make that that possible and embed trust from the beginning, but also to sort of alleviate and remove the burden of proof from community businesses, which I think Jess's point at the end there about sort of trust us and leave us alone sort of chimes with that. So we've been thinking around a range of different ways to do that, and you know, one of the ways that we can do it, given where we are as an organization, is to use our existing data to really sort of strip away as many of the reporting requirements as possible for those organizations, so they can just get on with the work. So that's sort of part of we're trying to do. But one of my other reflections, both with my Power to Change hat on, but also with a trustee hat on for a community business that I'm involved with, is that there is still a challenge, I think, about organizations, and not just community businesses, all organizations carving out spaces to and time to reflect and make strategic decisions. And I've seen some really good examples where the relationship with the funder can help carve out that time. So one of the things I'm involved with outside of work is the Heritage Compass program funded by the Architectural Heritage Fund, which has a very well structured curriculum which encourages peer-to-peer connection and carves out that space in an organization's delivery to reflect and make strategic decisions. And we're also trying to do the same for our Powering Up program as well, which provides a small grant but lots of time and support for organizations to really think about how they develop. So there's something about someone or a collective of people holding that space and convening that space for that, as well as then thinking about how to make accessing money as easy as possible and as simple and flexible as possible as well. So I think those sort of probably my reflections on Neil's question, but also Anna, I think it was Anna's question as well, and hopefully connecting the two together.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now we're coming to the close. So what I'm going to do is ask the panelists to just offer sort of up to 2 minutes reflections on what they've heard today from their fellow panelists, what they want to take away from today's discussion. But just the last question was from Finn Jensen about how we deal with climate change, mitigation, adaptation. And it just seems to be particularly relevant as world leaders jet away from Sharm el-Sheikh after COP27. If you have any particular thoughts on that, please do build them into your closing comments. But we'll go through the closing comments in the same order as the opening comments. So Stuart first, then Margaret, Lily, Jess, and then Stephen. So Stuart, over to you.
Yeah, I guess something I've picked up, and it's more of a consequence of using that structure from Swarovski and Plunkett around the stages of development. And it's something that I've been kind of thinking about in another role I have with a CVS, where we support community organizations, they don't necessarily identify as businesses. And actually, yes, we want to kind of support them in their development if that's part of our objective, but sometimes we need to listen to them and realize that maybe they're happy where they are. And that could mean that they're in that early stage as a community business and they don't want to go any further. And it takes me back to when I was involved in sport and, coaches, there's a bit of a trope that they're trying to make Olympic athletes, but actually some people don't want that. Some people just want to do their more leisurely sport. And that approach should be taken with supporting community businesses as well. Some are happy to stay as what we would see early stage organizations. That's all they want to do. Maybe they have a very close-knit community, and by staying as that early stage organization, they can more closely meet the needs of that community, and they don't need to do any more or any less than that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stuart. Margaret.
I think one of the things I'm going to take away from the conversations today is the cultural development discussion. I mean, it's something that I haven't really given a lot of thought to, but I think today has really sort of emphasized the need for me to sort of take that on board, but also in discussions that I have with some of the students here as well. And I think additionally, Jess is someone that I want to connect with as well. I think she said some really inspirational stuff, things that resonate very strongly with me, and I'd like to maybe tap into her at some point. And Steve, I think it'll be really good to explore the discussion around succession planning a little bit more, particularly around building young leaders, building the future as well.
Thank you, Margaret. Lily.
Thanks. Today's conversations really made me kind of reflect on the role of the funder and being that kind of trusting and enabling body that is able to it has the resources to give long-term core grants it has the kind of connections to give that support needed, but it also does need to kind of, funders need to take a step back and to trust. And the stuff around venture capitalists that Jess was saying was, it's so true, and businesses have that trust inherently, so why shouldn't this sector as well? And the other thing that I've thought of is around the kind of, found interesting around the funder, was around the kind of, how do you get into business and where the gaps are. So Jess's point around women with children having that gap and that space to be able to get involved in community businesses, where are those other gaps, and how can funders then bring new people in or change cultures and mindsets that makes that a viable way of living, rather than just the kind of getting a job and so on. And I feel like, to Margaret's point, that's getting into schools, getting into colleges, and paving the way for young people to think in a slightly different way as well.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Lily. Jess.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Lily. One of the things that I'd reflect is this whole conversation's reminded me how much there still is a power imbalance. There's still quite a strong power imbalance between the funders and the funded. Despite a huge amount of work to break that down and try not to act like that. And I wonder, I feel like some of that is just inherent in the grant giving, and I don't know how that's tackled. There's a sort of assumption that if you're handing out cash, it must be that there's a reason that this business needs cash, which must reflect somehow that if they're a good business, they wouldn't need your money. They do need your money, so they must need help also. Rather than acknowledge that often, particularly grants in this sector, are because of a structural situation in the economy where we're trying to do something which doesn't fit with the model. And of course, you need funding to be able to do that and to disrupt in that way. And I just wonder whether there's something about that that still needs kind of unpicking somewhere, and how we really get over this hierarchical kind of power imbalance that's going on. In a more positive sense, this conversation has really reminded me of why I love this sector and why I love my peers in it particularly, and how brilliant they are and how important they are. And I'd be delighted to connect with you, Margaret, so let's increase that peer network again. And it's also made me think I need to try and find another week away with my fellow founders and really get a bit under the, really get into our kind of direction and adaptation over the next decade or so. So a good bit of a boost and an incentive to do that as well. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Good luck with finding that time, Jess. Stephen.
Yeah, there's so much in this discussion that has resonated, and I think lots of lessons, but also challenges. I think one of the key things that I'm sort of taking away from this conversation and also want to reinforce is about the importance of trust, and how that, I think, will play a key role into addressing potentially some of the power imbalances that Jess just alluded to. Because I think, before and after before and during the pandemic, so after the lockdown restrictions, lots of community businesses across the country, they were just working like relentlessly, day and night to support their communities, and they displayed like this really incredible agility to make where they live better for everyone. And part of what enabled them to do that, but also enabled others to support them to do that, was trust. So trusting that they knew best, or that communities knew best how to tackle the challenges they were facing, but also to trust them with the sort of funding and resources that that funders have, and passing that over. And I think that's going to be really important going forward. And I think community businesses have a really key role to play in recovery from this sort of series of crises that we're facing at the moment, as well as preparing for and tackling future ones, such as climate change. So linking back to Finn's point, and in order to do that, we all need to work together to help and support the sector to sort of continually evolve and improve to meet these challenges, but also to think about how we get ahead of the curve. And I would love to see community businesses as a default model in the net zero economy, for example, rather than replicating some of the existing power and wealth inequalities that we see at the moment. And so that's quite central. And then I think Margaret's point around succession, and then also the diversity of the sector, is also going to be key to enabling that, because it's going to be absolutely essential if we want to get ahead of the curve and make this part of the status quo in the future. So that's what we're doing at Power to Change. That's what we're encouraging other funders and policymakers, etc., to do as well. So really think about how we work together with communities to enable them to unlock the sort of skills, talents, and resources that exist within them.
Stephen, thank you very much, and thank you to all my panelists for their contribution. Thank you to the audience for the great questions that we've had in the comments in the webinar chat. I said at the start, we've got, of course, the autumn statement coming on later today. And Jess, you made the point that never more needed, actually, over the next couple of years, if not the next couple of decades, frankly, community businesses. It's going to be a really tough time. And in who asked the question about climate change also posted the point about the cost of living crisis. We are going to face a really challenging few years, and the role of funders in providing both grant but also support is going to be so important for that. So thank you all for doing it. As I say, please do visit the repository to read Stuart's report. I've just posted the link in the chat there if you want to see it. And Dan Woolley, I saw right at the last minute that you had your hand up in the audience lecture. So I'm sorry I didn't ask you to join in the conversation, but if you want to contact me later, I'm happy to kind of dialogue separately with you or put you in touch with the panelists. That would be helpful. All that remains for me to say is a big thank you to Stephen and Pat Change, who've been supporting the Institute for Community Studies in running these events. We'll have at least one more, I hope, before the end of the year or early in the new year. But it's been a really really powerful morning, really good conversation. So thank you all, and all the best. Bye-bye.